My guest today is Trevor Miles, Vice President of Thought Leadership with Kinaxis. Trevor, welcome.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Now, we all know that the adoption of new technologies can enable new processes to emerge, but as this happens, what are some of the lessons that companies have learned in the process?
Bob, a key thing that people are learning is that it's the space between individual applications that's really the important part that is missing. All too often we find that Excel is absolutely embedded in that process of getting different organizations to communicate and collaborate with each other. So you see Excel and email being the mode of communication to get the translation going between different functions. And that is the fundamental process that is not being enabled in today's world.
Does this cause constant rekeying or manual manipulation of data between those different solutions? I mean, what happens as a result of that Excel gap sitting right there between applications?
There are two things. One is, in fact, data inconsistency, and the other one is decision latency. So people are always asking, is this the right data? Is this the right version of the Excel spreadsheet? So they're spending a lot of time trying to make sure that they're working on the right thing rather than trying to do the right thing by being sure that they have the right information.
I find it interesting that companies I talk to today, well, for that matter, companies I've talked to for the last decade or more, we're always talking about we've got to get off Excel. Mm-hmm. We've got to become automated. We've got to become more unified and integrated in our operations. And then you talk to companies today and they say, yeah, we still use Excel. Mm-hmm. What has stopped them from doing that long ago? What was the barrier to moving ahead?
Well, there's two things. One is the fact that we have a very legacy approach to how we are thinking of processes. The processes that we have adopted really stem from the 1960s when there wasn't technology and capability to enable new processes. So in fact, what we've done is take those technologies or those process descriptions and then develop technology to satisfy each of those functional capabilities described in those processes, forgetting the fact that we'd actually described these processes when there was no technology to enable a different process. So we've created these islands of automation is the key thing. So that is just embedded an age-old paradigm. So people want to get away from that, but it's the manner in which they are trying to enable those different processes that is just lacking.
So this leads to the driving principles that led advanced planning and scheduling systems that were developed as recently as the 1990s, not even the 1960s, but describe the problem. Is it the same thing you're talking about? It creates these islands of information?
Yes, exactly. So, command and control type of structures where people have to go through a whole approval process in one function in order to transmit that information to another function. What has happened is the advanced planning and scheduling systems developed in the 1990s embedded that process of cascaded planning, where each function does their planning and then hands it off to the next function. But the problem is, in those functions, they have no idea of the chaos or the advantage they're creating for the next function. So they have this island of information, and people are desperately looking at ways in which they can actually reduce those barriers. The problem is the underlying technology embeds those barriers of communication.
In a way, you're also saying that you cannot impose new technology on old business processes, correct?
Correct. And in fact, I'm saying one step beyond that, and unfortunately what we have developed in the 1990s is embedding the processes that were already out of date to a large extent, and people are trying to overcome, but they don't have any means to.
Yeah. Well, tell me what are the different considerations involved when, let's say, when you're comparing embedded capabilities in a supply chain specific application
Yes.
versus general purpose technology capabilities that have to be adapted for a supply chain context. Talk about the differences there.
Okay, so what we always see is there's a great systems thinker called Russell Ackoff, who talked about the fact if you go out and get the 100 best cars in the world, and from those cars you take out the best components, and you bring them into the room, and you put all of those components together, what is it that you get? You don't even get a car, because the simple fact is the parts don't fit together. And the other thing he says is that a system is not the sum of its parts. That's the key story about the automobile. The key attribute of a system is the fact of the interactions between those parts. So he also tells the story about the fact that as a person, we live, we think, we write. And he says, cut off your hand and put it on a table and see what it does. It cannot write, okay? So that is the key point I'm trying to get across here. Embedding those capabilities into a unified whole is really where the advantage is. If you take these individual components, a general purpose business activity monitoring system, coupled with a general purpose planning system with a general purpose business intelligence system, and you try and put all of these things together, you end up with Ackoff's car, with the least fitting capabilities, and you've got to spend a lot of time bringing those things together. But if you take the principles of business activity monitoring, which is when do I know that I'm not meeting my business objectives, and you embed that in your capabilities within supply chain. Or you take the principles of social media and you say, people need to know that something is wrong. Who needs to know? And you embed that in your technology. You get a much more performance system that enables this end-to-end process. You embed the capabilities of capturing assumptions, all of that type of information, and it resides in a single location. And that you get then much shorter decision cycles, much more collaboration, much more natural collaboration, as opposed to people sending Excel spreadsheets or extracting Excel spreadsheets from one system, attaching them to an email, sending them to somebody else who goes and makes a change to the Excel spreadsheet, brings it back in, and now you've got to try and import and understand what the changes are. So that is loosely coupled general purpose solutions trying to satisfy an end-to-end process. But if you embed all of those capabilities, you get a much more performant process.
I wonder if it's true that companies used to think that the answer was purely a technological one. All we need is an API, an automated programming interface, to just tie all these applications together. Everything will be fine.
Yes, and that's the fundamental flaw, because now the data is different and you've got to try and do data translation. Does the manner in which you refer to an item in one application mean the same thing in another item? We work with some customers that have as many as 50 different instances of ERP, and the same item is referred to by a different item number in nearly all of those different ERP systems. So how do you then get that information into a unified whole so that people can actually understand that they're talking about the same thing across all of those instances?
And information isn't just coming from your ERP, it's coming from multiple sources. It has to all reside in a single centralized place and be interpreted in an intelligent way and in the same way by everyone in the organization. So that makes it interesting.
And I'll add that one more word to that is harmonized. So there's units of measure conversions, there's time bucket conversions, there's all of this other stuff that needs to be performed so that you've got the same view of the supply chain.
Now, as leaders move toward end-to-end supply chain, or whatever you want to call them, value chain networks, how should they be evaluating the technology that is out there to enable them? How do they make sure that this particular technology will deliver the desired results?
There are three things that they really need to look for. Undoubtedly, we still need the underlying capabilities of doing the functional planning. You need to be able to do that sufficiently. But more importantly is the fact that you need to be able to support the organization in its process of executing across these multiple functions. And the third one is that you need to make sure that you're not embedding a cascaded decision process, meaning that these functions, the key thing you're trying to do is break down the functional silos. So people need to be able to work concurrently. So demand plan isn't created and then an inventory plan or distribution plan and then a supply plan. You need to be able to evaluate all of that information in parallel so that people can work concurrently, because that's the only way we're going to be able to shrink those decision cycles. If you look at many standard S&OP process descriptions, it's a 5-stage model where you gather data, then you create your demand plan, then you create a supply plan, and then you go through some reconciliation, and then finally you go through an executive approval process. That's a 5-stage cascade that spans a long period of time. The only way you're going to reduce that decision cycle is doing everything concurrently, stacking them up with people all working on the same data. So these are the type of things that they need to look at. So it's the fact that people can work simultaneously off the same set of information. It's got key planning capabilities, and it supports the collaborative nature of a process of that form.
Should all of those different functions be at the table when it comes time to make a decision as to acquiring the technology? Does everyone have to be there and put in their own 2 cents, or should it be purchased at a high level and then filter down and bring them in afterwards?
We did receive at one stage a set of RFPs, 5 different RFPs from the same organization that were all going through different selection processes by different functions. It turned out that the COO had given a mandate to the entire supply chain organization that their supply chain processes needed to change. As it had gone down through the hierarchy, the budget got split up, and it got split up into different functional processes, forgetting overall that the COO, of course, was looking for a unified process across all of these functions. So we were actually able to elevate the story back up to illustrate the fact that the decision needed to be made at the more senior level to satisfy that end-to-end process, because that was what the COO was after. But just in our usual processes of organizational structure and our way in which we disaggregate the planning function, they had gone through the process of disaggregating the decision process, and each function was making an isolated decision with no consideration about how all of those things would stick together.
Trevor, thank you so much for sharing your intelligence with us on this subject, helping companies to understand technology, business process going hand in hand, and how we can achieve true end-to-end supply chains. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for your time, Bob.
I've been speaking with Trevor Miles of Kinaxis. Thank you very much for watching.